Well, hello again, it's Alister McGrath, and welcome to this third day of the series of lectures on Christian apologetics at Regent College Vancouver. And today I want to look at the use of fiction in apologetics. Why do we tell stories? And I think obviously we could say they appeal to our imaginations, they pass on to us information about the past and its importance for our present. And cultural anthropologists have highlighted the importance of this apparently universal human tendency to tell stories. So stories matter. They're part of the cultural landscape, and this idea plays an important role in narrative apologetics, which we looked at in the previous lecture. But here's the question that arose, and I think it's worth looking at in more detail. How can we use stories that are not necessarily true to communicate and commend the gospel? Why should we use fiction to tell the truth? Now, obviously, some Christian writers were very concerned about this point. For example, Richard Baxter felt that Christians ought not to read fiction because it created a taste for fabricated truth. But I have to say that other Puritan writers were rather more astute, and they saw the potential of fiction to capture the human imagination and allow it to engage theological and spiritual truths. Now, you might think, for example, of John Bunyan's book Pilgrim's Progress, which is clearly a work of fiction, and yet which equally clearly communicated some very important Christian ideas and values. Now, my own view is that fiction is simply religiously neutral, in the sense that it requires no religious commitment on the part of its readers or hostility towards religion on the part of its readers. The key point is that these narratives enable us to explore what these commitments might look like and feel like through narrated depictions of the life of faith. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, that's one of the reasons why Marilynne Robinson has gained such a large following for her fiction, which is deeply shaped by Reformed theology. And of course, it's also true of C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. And it's worth looking at what Rowan Williams, who's a very highly perceptive commentator on Lewis's work, found to be so special about this series of novels. So here's what he says. See what you make of this. But in spite of everything, Lewis is not just trying to translate Christian doctrine. He's trying to evoke what it feels like to believe in the God of Christian revelation. Now, I find that very interesting. Do you see what he's getting at? Lewis is helping us to understand what it feels like to know God, to be a person of faith. And Lewis's narrative for Rowan Williams strips away the delusions that we so often spin about our lives and lets us, in fact, actually forces us to see ourselves in a realistic manner. So Williams sees Lewis as offering a penetrating critique of, what I'll quote from Williams here, the over-optimistic humanism which he saw as the greatest corporate self-deceit of the age. So here's the point here. Williams sees Lewis as telling a story that allows us to see humanity in a Christian manner. Yes, it's a piece of fiction. But in Lewis's hands, fiction becomes theologically transparent, allowing us to see deep truths and respond to them appropriately. So again, let's stay with Rowan Williams and listen to these words, which I think are really penetrating and helpful. And I quote, "Putting humanity in its place is an important aspect of the Narnia stories, both in the obvious negative sense of puncturing human self-confidence and illusory optimism, and in the positive sense of reaffirming the unique role of humanity in the history not only of our own universe, but also of other worlds. Knowing the truth about ourselves as individuals and as a human race obviously involves being able to see where we actually are in relation to Creator and creation." So there's the point, and I think it's a good one, that fiction can communicate truths in ways that can get through to people in ways that sermons or theological textbooks just can't. And if you're a preacher or give apologetics talks or write articles or post blogs, then you can use fiction to do apologetics. It helps you to connect with your audiences partly because you are using an intermediary or a proxy to present the ideas of the gospel, thus making it easier for your audience to enter into your world of thought. Now, here's a point which I've always found helpful. For a lot of people, fiction is a shared, common cultural language. And so you and I really need to learn to speak it, or at least one of its dialects, so we can connect up with the wider audience we have in mind. So the obvious question, I guess, is what writers can you use and what can you do with them? And I have to say those are two rather daunting questions because they cover so much ground. Many apologists try to engage with novels that seem to have captured the imagination of their culture because they know people will be able to relate to these if they use them. A good example is a massive outpouring of scholarly works and cultural commentaries on the apologetic significance of Harry Potter, or how we can use Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy to open up some deep apologetic questions. And these are good approaches. In this lecture, I'm going to look at a small and manageable group of examples. And in doing this, I'm not trying to limit you in any way to the people I mentioned. I'm just illustrating possibilities. And really what I want to encourage you to do is to find a set of authors that you trust, that you feel you can use to make important apologetic points which otherwise you might not be able to. So let's turn to the first of these four authors I'm going to look at in this lecture, and that's Dorothy L. Sayers. And as I'm sure you know, she enjoyed writing detective fiction. So why do we like detective novels so much? One of the most distinctive features of human nature, I think, is an innate yearning to try and make sense of the strange and puzzling world that we see around us. And obviously one very good example of this is the natural sciences, because in many ways what they are doing is trying to make sense of the workings of the natural world. And often seems to me that one of the most distinguishing features of the natural sciences is their emphasis on intelligibility. It's all about the scientific quest for making or being able to account for natural phenomena in ways that are logical coherence. But of course, this emphasis on making sense of things is found far beyond the realm of the natural sciences, and we do find it in Christianity. It may not be the dominant theme of the Christian faith, but it's certainly an important aspect of its overall vision of reality. And again, just to be personal for a moment, this is what drew me to the Christian faith in the first place. Obviously, my vision of Christianity has expanded since then, but it was very important for me at the beginning. Now, the American philosopher Charles Peirce argued that the fundamental principle of scientific thinking was the process he called abduction, the attempt to find an intellectual pattern which made sense of what was observed, even if this pattern was not itself disclosed by those observations themselves. And for Peirce, abduction is a process of identifying or creating explanations for checking out against the evidence. And perhaps most importantly, Peirce argued that this process introduces a new idea, an idea that seems to connect up all the observations to disclose a pattern rather than just a random collection of facts. So Peirce invites us to generate theories and explanations and test them out to find out how well they seem to accommodate the evidence. And as Peirce understands it, abduction is thus a kind of search strategy which leads us to generate what he called some promising explanatory conjecture, which is then subject to further test. And for Peirce, the best example of this kind of thinking is found in the natural sciences. But he was very clear you can find this line of thought elsewhere as well, as for example in medical diagnosis or in detective fiction. And the point here is that our observations are really clues to the deeper meaning or inner workings of our world. We want to find a theory that holds everything together, and we enjoy the challenge of trying to find the best theory. Now, I think that helps us to understand why we like detective novels so much. we actually quite enjoy the challenge of finding the best theory. We get a kind of deep sense of satisfaction in putting all the clues together. And writers like, well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, Earl Stanley Gardner, and Dorothy L. Sayers, they built their reputations on being able to hold their readers' interest as countless mysterious murder cases were solved before their eyes. And we just love reading fictional detectives like Sherlock Holmes or Philip Marlowe or Perry Mason, Lord Peter Wimsey, and of course Miss Jane Marple. And these writers really are good at their job. They assemble a body of evidence, a series of observations, and they challenge us to find the hidden pattern that makes sense of them. So let's look at Dorothy L. Sayers, because she particularly appreciated this point. And she often pointed out how her own detective novels were really about discerning a pattern within events, which point to the way in which the intellectual puzzle of the clues could be solved. And she developed this theme in a lecture which she proposed to broadcast to the French nation in early 1940 to bolster their morale in the early stages of the Second World War by emphasizing the importance of France as a source of great literary detectives. Well, that's quite a challenge, I think. But unfortunately, Sayers' talk celebrating the French literary detective was never given. What happened was, as you probably know, Paris fell to invading German armies shortly before, and she wasn't able to go to France to speak. But we have the text of the lecture, and I can tell you that one of the central themes of Sayers' lecture is that detective fiction appeals to this deep yearning to make sense of what on the surface seemed to be an unrelated series of events. Yet the point is that within those events are clues, markers of significance, which can lead to the solution. Now, Sayers puts this point rather nicely, and I'm going to read you to the sentence, and then I'm going to try and explain it. She writes, "We follow step by step Ariadne's thread, and finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth." Now, we need to pause there and focus on the central image of the analogy. Bear in mind, Sayers was steeped in a classical education, and she drew on the ancient Greek legend of Minos, king of Crete, who instructed the great architect Daedalus to build a labyrinth near his palace at Knossos to house the Minotaur, a kind of hybrid of a man and a bull. And this labyrinth was famously complicated. Once you were inside it, you'd never find your way out again. Now, Minos' daughter, Ariadne, fell in love with the Athenian hero Theseus, who was due to enter the labyrinth, and she gave him a ball of red thread. And as he went in to the labyrinth, he unrolled the thread. And you see, by following the thread back to its source, he could find his way out of the labyrinth after having found and killed the Minotaur. So Ariadne's thread is the image that Sayers used here to the idea of finding your way through a dark and confusing structure. And Sayers realized how this very potent image of a thread could be used as an analogy for the intellectual framework within which the detective novel was set. So Sayers, like so many before her, appreciated that the detective novel appeals to our implicit belief in the intrinsic rationality of the world around us, and of course our own ability to discover its deeper patterns. So something important or interesting has taken place. A good example from Sherlock Holmes, the mysterious death of Sir Charles Baskerville. So what really happened? See, we weren't there to observe what really happened. We have to reconstruct the event by a careful analysis of clues. This allows us to figure out what the most likely explanation is of what really happened. And here again, the image of the thread appears in a slightly different form. We're speaking of a thread of argument, a way of linking together a series of events or observations so we can see the pattern. That's a very powerful image, and of course it's been used by many writers. For example, the great Victorian philosopher of science William Whewell argued that we must find the right thread on which to string the pearls of our observations so that they disclose their true pattern. Here's what Whewell says. I think it's actually quite interesting. He writes, "The facts are known, but they are insulated and unconnected. The pearls are there, but they will not hang together until someone provides the string." So that's the background to Sayers' detective novels. I think they can be seen as a literary application of what we would now call in the philosophy of science inference to the best explanation. So what's that all about? Well, it's basically the idea that for every set of observations, there are several competing explanations. So we have to figure out which of these is the best. Which thread best connects and displays the pearls of our observations. And what criteria might be used to make this evaluation. So we can see this process of reflection in one of Sayers' detective novels, in this case, The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, set in London's high society during the 1920s. And Sayers opens her chapter describing Lord Peter Wimsey's breakthrough in the mystery surrounding the curious death of General Fenterman by reflecting on the criteria that you might use in choosing one theory over another. So here's the dialogue in which this point is explored. "So what put you on to this poison business?" Detective Inspector Parker asked. "Aristotle chiefly," replied Wimsey. "He says, you know, that one should always prefer the probable impossible to the improbable possible. It was possible, of course, that the general should have died off in that neat way at the most confusing moment. But how much nicer and more probable that the whole thing had been stage managed." So you see the point that once Wimsey had found this pattern, he was able to superimpose it, to lay it over the otherwise puzzling series of events at the Bologna Club, and show how all of these threads were woven together in his intellectual solution. He was able to see a pattern which he shared with his readers. But for Sayers in general, life was a quest for pattern, a pattern of meaning in life. And she was convinced that Christianity gave her a tool by which she could make sense of the universe, disclosing its otherwise hidden patterns. And for Sayers, the gospel provided the thread that linked together everything that really mattered and helped us to make sense of life. It allowed us to find the deeper patterns in life and realize how these were initially illuminated and then transformed by God. So you can use that approach in your apologetics presentations. But let's move on now to think about C.S. Lewis and his fictional realm of Narnia. Now we can track Lewis's Narnia project back to 1939, when Lewis began to explore the idea of writing children's stories. With the outbreak of the Second World War in Britain in September 1939, some children were evacuated to Oxford from London, and they lived with Lewis in his Oxford home, The Kilns. And that seems to have been the stimulus for writing these stories. My personal view is that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the best of the series, and I think you also ought to read it before The Magician's Nephew, because it stands alone. And as we read this remarkable work, we find echoes of the books that Lewis read as a child. For example, some works by Edith Nesbit and, of course, The Wind in the Willows. Why does Narnia have such a deep appeal? Why is this work of fiction so important for Christian apologetics? Well, I think we can't hope to understand the deep appeal of Narnia without actually appreciating the place of stories in shaping our understanding of reality in general. And the Chronicles of Narnia, I think, resonate very strongly with the basic human instinct that our own story is part of something grander, something bigger. And that once we grasp this bigger story, if you like, it allows us to see our situation in a new and more meaningful way. It's as if a veil is taken away, or a door is opened, or someone draws aside curtains, so we can see our own story, but as part of a much bigger story. And that helps us to understand how we fit into this bigger scheme of things, and we begin to discover the difference that we can make to things. Now, like his Oxford friend J.R.R. Tolkien, who I'll talk about very shortly, Lewis was deeply aware of the imaginative power of what they both called myths. Now, for us, a myth is something that's untrue. For Lewis and Tolkien, they are stories that try to make sense of who we are, where we find ourselves, what's gone wrong with things, and what can be done about it. So for Lewis, a myth is not a false story that's told to deceive, but a rich story that on the one hand resonates with the deeper structures of reality, and on the other hand has an ability to connect up with the human imagination. And Tolkien was able to use this idea of a myth to saturate his trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, with a mysterious, sort of otherness, which hints at a reality beyond which human reason can fathom. And Lewis actually is very similar. He's steeped in the riches of medieval and Renaissance literature. He knows how myths work. And Lewis managed to find the right voice and the right words to get past the suspicions of what he called a fully waking imagination of a logical mind. And somehow Narnia seemed able to provide a deeper, brighter, more wonderful and more meaningful world than anything we knew through our own experience. And though we all know that the Chronicles of Narnia are fictional, they nevertheless seem far more true to life than many supposedly factual works. Now, Lewis always recognized that the stories he told in Narnia might seem, just childish nonsense to some of his readers, but actually, to others, they are completely transformative. These stories disclose possibilities. They open up alternative ways of thinking about the world and ourselves. And Lewis's stories show us that it's possible for the weak and foolish to have a noble calling in a dark world. They show us that our deepest intuitions very often point us to the true meaning of things, or that there's something that's indeed beautiful and wonderful at the heart of the universe, and that we can find and embrace this. Now, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is about finding a master ring that rules the other rings. Then you have to destroy it because it's so dangerous and so destructive. But Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia are also about a quest for something very significant, and that's a master story that makes sense of all other stories, and then embracing this story because of its power to give meaning and value to life. So you can see why this question, which is the true story, is so important. Which is the real story? Which are merely its shadows? Which are fabrications? Tales that are spun to entrap and deceive us. Now, I've looked at this point already, but let's go through it again because it is so important. At an early stage in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the four children begin to hear stories about the true origins and destiny of Narnia. And they're puzzled. They know they can't all be right. They have to make decisions about what persons and what stories can be trusted. And as I pointed out in the previous lecture, there are many stories about who we are, what we're meant to be, and what has gone wrong. And we need to find a way of deciding which is the most trustworthy. Is Narnia really the realm of the White Witch, or is it the realm of Aslan, who's coming back at any moment? And gradually, as they reflect on these stories and the people that tell them, one story emerges as the most trustworthy. The story, of course, of Aslan. Aslan, if you like, holds together in his person all the stories of Narnia. And The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe itself hints at this big picture, which of course is expanded in the remaining novels in the series. And what you see happening here is that this big story, this grand narrative, makes sense of the riddles that the children experience as they travel through Narnia. It allows the children to understand their experiences with a new clarity and depth, like a camera lens bringing a landscape into sharp focus. These stories make sense of Narnia. And we need to tell stories to make sense of our world. And the point here is that Lewis did not invent the story of Narnia. He borrowed and adapted one that he already knew well and had found to be true and trustworthy. And of course, this is the Christian narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and final consummation. Now, as you know, I hope you know anyway, Lewis moved from simply believing in God to believing in Christianity in September 1931, because Tolkien explained to him about the idea of true myth and how Christianity told a story about incarnation, and Lewis suddenly realized how everything came together. Lewis came to believe in Christianity partly because of the quality of its literary vision, its ability to give a faithful and realistic account of life. And thus Lewis actually was drawn to Christianity not so much on account of arguments in its favour, but rather by grasping its big picture, its compelling vision of reality, which really drew him imaginatively. And as he inhabited it, it justified itself rationally. So I want to suggest the Chronicles of Narnia are an imaginative retelling of the Christian grand narrative, fleshed out with ideas that Lewis absorbed from the Christian literary tradition. So basically, in using Narnia apologetically, you are indirectly using the story of Christianity itself. It's all about a good and beautiful creation being spoiled, being ruined by a fall, in which the Creator's power is denied and usurped. And then the Creator enters into the creation to break the usurper's power and restore things through a redemptive sacrifice. Yet here's the point: even after the coming of the Redeemer, the struggle against sin and evil continues, and that's not going to end until the final restoration and transformation of all things. So that's really the deep structure of the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis is retelling the Christian story and actually is inviting you to do the same, to find ways of retelling the Christian story that connect up with the experience of your audience. And what I think is so remarkable about Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia is actually he allows his readers to step inside this big story, to get inside it and feel what it's like to be part of it. And it's helpful, I think, to compare two of Lewis's books written about the same time, Mere Christianity, and that helps us to understand Christian ideas, and of course the Narnia stories. But these allow us to step inside and experience the Christian story and judge it by its ability to make sense of things and to chime in with our deepest intuitions about truth, beauty, and goodness. I think that is a very important point. Mere Christianity and the Narnia series have slightly different audiences in mind. And if you read the Chronicles of Narnia in the order of publication, you begin with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is all about the coming of the Redeemer. And then The Magician's Nephew deals with the narrative of creation and fall. And The Last Battle concerns the ending of the old order and the advent of the new creation. And you can use those to help you explain ideas like incarnation, creation, and the hope of heaven in very powerful imaginative ways. So what about the other four novels? Prince Caspian, Voyage of Dawn Treader, The Horse and His Boy, and The Silver Chair. Well, these deal with the period between these two advents. And interestingly, in these four books, Lewis explores the life of faith, which is lived in the tension between the past and the future comings of Aslan. And in these books, Aslan is at one and the same time an object of memory and an object of hope. Often Lewis talks about an exquisite longing for Aslan when he cannot be seen clearly, of a robust and gracious faith, of people of character who walk trustingly through the Shadowlands, and who learn to deal with a world in which they experience evil and doubt. And I think these novels are actually very powerful, and I think you can see how you might use them to develop some apologetic themes. For example, how you live in a world of uncertainty and doubt, and yet a world of hope. And for me, I think one theme that really stands out is, again, this need to choose the right story, the right meta-narrative that makes sense of us and our world, which shows us how things went wrong, what can be done about it, and gives us hope for the future. And we learn to position ourselves within this story to help us work out who we really are and what we're meant to be doing. And you can use this apologetically to ask people to imagine stepping into the story of the Christian faith. How does this help you understand who you really are, why you matter, how then you can live in hope? And that really is important because it poses a challenge to controlling narratives of Western culture, for example, that adopted by the New Atheism, to which we'll return later in this series of lectures. Now, earlier in this series of lectures, I spoke about the importance of the idea of the Incarnation. And in defending and explaining this idea, I used Mary Midge's idea of multiple maps to help us see what this important doctrine is doing. And I won't say it's very useful, but actually it is imaginatively dull. And since we're looking at Lewis on stories here, I thought I might just supplement what I said about the Incarnation by looking at a narrative approach to this idea that Lewis used in a remarkable sermon he preached in a London church during the Second World War. Now, the background to this is that Lewis learned how to dive back in 1930, and he began to realize its potential as an analogy for what he was coming to see as a core theme of the Christian faith, and that, of course, was the Incarnation. So in this sermon, Lewis invited his audience to imagine a diver. And the diver wants to retrieve something precious that has fallen into the mud at the bottom of a deep lake. And Lewis asks us to imagine the diver plunging. I'm going to read to you now from the sermon, plunging down through the green and warm and sunlit water into the pitch black, cold, freezing water, down into the mud and slime, then up again, his lungs almost bursting, back again to the green and warm and sunlit water, and then at last out into the sunshine, holding in his hand the dripping thing he went down to get. So I imagine you're wondering, what is this dripping thing at the bottom of the lake that was worth all that effort and risk to bring to the surface? Well, Lewis tells us it's us. We are God's wayward creatures, and God descended into his own universe and rose again, bringing human nature up with him. See the point? That's a story about the Incarnation. For Lewis, the doctrine of the Incarnation tells us the story of how God plunged into our world to perform a rescue operation. It can be summed up in the biblical affirmation, John 1:14, that the Word became flesh and lived among us. And that's a very powerful affirmation. And the Greek word translated here, by the way, as lived, actually really means pitched his tent. And it offers us this very powerful image of Israel as a wandering people in a period which is looked back to by the prophets as a time when she was close to God. And as they travel on their journey of faith, they find a new tent pitched in their midst because God has come to dwell with them. And the point being made is that God is with us as our constant companion and consoler as we journey through the wilderness of life. So Lewis here tells us a story to help us make sense of the Incarnation. He engages our imagination. He makes us receptive to this deep incarnational theme. What Lewis did there really invites us to ask what stories we might borrow or develop to make points that could help someone grasp the deep logic of the Christian faith or its firm grip on the realities of life. But let's now come back to the whole question of fiction as a way of communicating the truth. And let's look at a monumental fantasy work, which actually Lewis helped to bring to birth. Now I'm talking about J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Now, Tolkien didn't just write stories like The Lord of the Rings, he developed theories about why we as human beings find stories so easy to tell and so interesting to hear. And for Tolkien, our natural inclination and capacity to create stories like The Lord of the Rings are actually the result of being created in the image of God. Now, I want you to listen to this quote from Tolkien, which makes this point very clearly. Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And Tolkien is very often described as developing a theology of sub-creation. He suggests that we create stories that are ultimately patterned on the grand story of God. So we tell stories because we bear God's image that are unconsciously patterned along the lines of this great story of creation and redemption, and that reflect our true identity as God's creatures and our true destiny as lying with God. As I'm sure you know, back in 1939, Tolkien gave a lecture up in Scotland called On Fairy Stories. And he later expanded and developed this, setting out his view that imaginative writing concerns how human beings exercise their destiny because they bear the image of God as sub-creators. An author experiences the world unfolding out of her mind. And for Tolkien, this is one way of reflecting the ultimate and original act of imagining, namely God's creation of the universe. So for Tolkien, the Christian narrative explains something very important: why we tell stories of meaning in the first place. And as I touched on in the previous lecture, Tolkien holds that the Christian gospel enfolds and proclaims what he calls a story of a larger kind that embraces what he found to be good and true and beautiful in great literature. Now, there's little doubt in my mind that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings incorporates some really significant apologetic issues like living with uncertainty, coping with adversity. And Tolkien uses this deftly crafted narrative which allows new insights into these old problems, and his views on the origins of evil and particularly its roots in the human desire for power are really important and well worth exploring with your audiences. For Tolkien, the desire for power, even the kind of power that will make us safe and sort out injustices, is actually a dangerous dream that can devour even the most innocent of people. It's true to life. And as I read Tolkien, I see him articulating a narrative that actually makes sense. It helps, it sort of resonates with our experience. It helps us to realize that we are very easily corrupted and led astray. You know, we think we are being purified and doing good, but actually we're corrupted and led astray. And actually, as the final scenes of The Lord of the Rings suggest, even the relinquishing of humanity's possessive tendencies, that turns out to be the key to defeating evil in the world. Now, why is Tolkien so influential? How can we learn from him? Well, obviously, he has been influential. Terry Pratchett, who's author of the Discworld series, once remarked that most modern fantasy just rearranges the furniture in Tolkien's attic. So how might we use Tolkien? Well, actually, there are lots of ways. First of all, I think we just need to note the importance he attaches to stories as ways of creating what he calls a secondary universe. And the point being made here is that the story holds this new universe together and invites us to enter it and explore it, testing its coherence and plausibility, and wondering if this secondary universe might actually be better than the primary universe that we really inhabit. And here's the point. If we find this secondary universe to be really persuasive and attractive, we begin to think, might this world actually exist? And that's a very powerful line of argument. I'm sure you remember its equivalent in Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and the passage I have in mind is in The Silver Chair, when Puddleglum speaks these words to the Green Lady who rules the dark underground kingdom, in which he and his three companions find themselves trapped. Now I want you to listen to these words, because I think they resonate with Tolkien and open up some really interesting possibilities. Suppose we have only dreamed and made up these things like sun, sky, stars and moon, and Aslan himself. In that case, it seems to me that the made-up things are a good deal better than the real ones. And if this black pit of a kingdom is the best you can make, then it's a poor world. And we four can make a dream world to lick your real one hollow. Build on that sense of dissatisfaction with reality and show how the Christian story resonates with deepest desires and hopes. But let's move on now, because we want to look at our final author, Marilynne Robinson, who we'll consider briefly because I think she has lots to say as well. Now, I've already talked about Marilynne Robinson in a series of lectures, and I've noted how she is very good at creating connections with secular readers, partly through her very engaging and inviting prose style, but also because she presents theological themes in a way that somehow seem able to get beneath the prejudices and watchful dragons of our modern secular consciousness. What I want to do here is to note how Robinson deals with the same theme in two of her books, and the theme is the complexity of the human condition and the role of stories in the creation, maintenance, and sometimes redirection of our sometimes fragile identity. Now, Robinson is actually very clearly academically qualified, but she first engaged this topic in detail in a scholarly work which is analytic rather than narrative in its approach, and that is The Death of Adam. But she also engages pretty much the same theme in her novel Gilead. And virtually every reader of both books that I have met makes the same point. It is so much easier to deal with Gilead than with the death of Adam. I mean, the quality of the analysis in Gilead merits comparison with that of the death of Adam, but its wisdom is expressed biographically and conversationally, using figures and images that cannot help but make us receptive to the ideas themselves. And the point I want to make is that narration, telling stories, seems to lead to accessibility. And I think we all need to bear that in mind. It is much easier to focus on a story that illustrates the nature of sin than to listen to an abstract conceptual analysis of sin. It's much easier to listen to someone tell how they discovered the meaning of life than to listen to a learned disquisition on the meaning of life in contemporary philosophy. Nevertheless, there are some gems in Robinson's Death of Adam. And one of those is this comment on Calvin's view on sin. So listen to what Robinson has to say. The belief that we are all sinners gives us excellent grounds for forgiveness and self-forgiveness, and is kindlier than any expectation that we might be saints, even while it affirms the standards all of us fail to attain. And what Robinson does, I think very successfully, is to offer us a set of narratives which help us to understand how fragile human identities can be. Things go wrong. Sin's a reality. And we need to be supported and nourished as we try to cope with shame, with memories of a dark past, and with loneliness. Now, Robinson's narratives, I have to say, are complex, and I have to confess I've tried to summarize them to make some points, but actually I wasn't really satisfied with my efforts. But I will say Robinson's narratives are rich, and there's apologetic gold in those novels. and I would encourage you to mine them. She tells stories of how you find the meaning of life, cope with weakness and sin, and you can retell those stories to give people hope in life. Raising the question of what other stories might we tell in order to help people understand how we should live. How do we know we are loved by God? How do we deal with doubt or the challenges of suffering? What stories might we use to open up the deeper meaning of, for example, the Christian idea of sin or the Incarnation? Now, in the next lecture, we're going to change the topic quite significantly. And we're going to move on to consider an issue that many people find to be both important and challenging. How do we deal with a scientific culture with this emphasis on proof? And that's an important question for many people, and I hope that you will find some of the approaches I've developed very useful. I used to be a scientist myself. I've thought about these things, and I look forward to speaking to you about them very soon.